My next patron question is from Graham, who wants to know my thoughts on a contested ending of a revered director's movie. What do you think of the ending to Steven Spielberg's AI Artificial Intelligence? The ending is often criticized for dragging on way too long, and it should have ended with the blue fairy. Do you agree with the critics, or do you like the extended ending? So when people bring up this movie, it's usually the ending that comes up. The general consensus for a long time was that the ending of the movie is too sentimental and feels too much like Spielberg wanting to give the main character, David the android, a happy close to his story, and that him waiting underwater for the blue fairy statue to turn him into a real boy would have been the ideal place to roll the credits. Part of that has to do with the project originating with Stanley Kubrick, whose movies were not exactly known for sentimentality or for necessarily happy endings. Spielberg, on the other hand, is known for making sentimental films with happy endings. So there was this extra scrutiny as critics wondered how Spielberg's filmmaking style and storytelling approach would gel with Kubrick's. Kubrick had himself assigned the movie to Spielberg before his death because he felt he would be a better fit for the Pinocchio-inspired aspects of the story. Upon the movie's release, it was felt that the darker parts, like the fair, which destroys robots for entertainment, and the Atlantic City-type place David and Gigolo Joe arrive in were Kubrick's, while the scenes centered on David learning about life and reading the story of Pinocchio were Spielberg's. The ending was especially seen as a Spielberg invention. Kubrick would never have included that. After all, this is the same filmmaker who decided to end A Clockwork Orange with Alex returning to a life of crime and debauchery, rather than the ending of the book where he decides to give up that lifestyle and become a regular member of society. However, Spielberg said in an interview shortly after the movie's release that all the parts of AI that people assume were Stanley's were mine, and all the parts of AI that people accused me of sweetening and softening and sentimentalizing were all Stanley's. Science fiction writer Ian Watson, who worked with Kubrick on the script for a few years, backed up Spielberg and said that the vast majority of the movie, including the ending, were all things Kubrick wanted and which they had personally discussed. Spielberg took on AI with the intention of honoring his late friend and making it in a way Kubrick would have been proud of. That includes the ending. Now, I used to be one of those people who felt the movie should have ended with David underwater and that the rest unnecessarily overextended the film with sentimentality. But on a viewing a few years ago, I changed my opinion on this, and I actually think the ending is sadder and more Kubrickian than people think. It even captures the mixed emotions one feels when watching a Kubrick film and the ordeals his characters go through. David gets his wish to be with his human mother again, but it will only be for one day. Thus, there's a bittersweet feeling when we see them having fun together, as this will be the last time they'll be able to do this. David is finally experiencing that joy he wanted, but it won't be for very long, and the movie leaves it ambiguous what happened after the credits rolled. Will David become depressed? Will he find a new purpose in his life? We don't know, and that's in keeping with a lot of the endings Kubrick often left his films with. There's also the fact that humanity has completely perished by the time these advanced AI have woken up David thousands of years later. David and Teddy thus remain the only ones with actual concrete memories of humanity during that time, both the good and the bad sides. So while the perception was that Spielberg had ended the movie on a sickly sweet note, that's not necessarily the case. Contrary to belief, I do think Kubrick showed a genuine interest in understanding humanity in his work. A lot of his movies are about man turning into machine and what leads him towards that point. Dr. Strangelove depicts how the absurdity of war and government could very well lead to the destruction of the entire world. Lolita shows a man's unhealthy and controlling obsession with a teenage girl completely destroying him, and The Shining shows how cabin fever leads a man to want to kill his family. But we also see how, despite going through their own fears and stresses in the hotel, his wife and son end up surviving and not giving in to the same evil. Interesting enough, The Shining originally ended with showing Wendy and Danny Torrance safe in the hospital, but Kubrick decided to remove that shortly after the release, resulting in one of his characteristic, ambiguous endings. However, according to Diane Johnson, who co-wrote the screenplay for The Shining, part of the reason Kubrick initially included that ending was because of his own affection he had developed for Wendy and Danny. Kubrick was a family man, so that makes sense, and as an example, the sentimental side he did have. Another interesting element of AI is that it starts with David having to learn about human feelings, and then in the end, he's the only being with human feelings left. He's a machine who becomes more human, as opposed to a lot of Kubrick characters who become more machine-like. I think Spielberg ultimately succeeded in bringing and honoring Kubrick's vision and fulfillment of that story to the screen, and that includes the ending of AI. Meanwhile, Jan Harlan, who worked closely with Kubrick on several projects, said that Kubrick wanted the movie to be akin to a Spielberg film and have that sense of wonder and magic so often associated with him. The reaction to AI and its ending and what has been revealed about the movie's development is a good example of how sometimes we might not always know the filmmakers who make the movies we watch and how there's a lot more to them than we might expect. Thank you for your question, Graham.